Hello and welcome again to the Storeroom of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we'll be finishing Daniel chapter 9, looking at verses 26 and 27. I'm going to open, though, with an overview of four major views of the first 69 weeks of the 70 weeks of Daniel. Then I will continue the Q&A format of the Exegetical Studies style of answering questions about the text. Although there are only two verses here that cover the 70th week of Daniel, there are multiple controversies about what these two verses mean. In this lesson, I don't intend to tell you exactly what you should believe about all 70 weeks or about the specific 70th week of Daniel. I hope to lay out for you the necessary information for you to make up your own mind as to what the 70 weeks of Daniel really mean for Daniel and for us and for the end times. This week we are going to finish chapter 9, the last couple of verses of that chapter. And like I said last week, in this detailed analysis of these verses, all the way from verses 24 through 27, I subtitled this whole thing, Why I Am Not Dogmatic About Eschatology, because I have studied this and I have found at least four interpretations of these few verses that have some leg to stand on. I think some of them are stronger than others, but I find four that are coherent in their description of what's going on, so that you can't just say, well, I'm going to completely disregard that there's no way that could possibly be true. No, I think there are four ways to view it that possibly could be true. Now, if you have other beliefs about eschatology that come from other passages, then that will inform your understanding of Daniel 9 and which one of the four variations are the ones you think are the most likely. So other places in Scripture are where you would want to go, actually, to have a solid eschatology. And then you would want to see how Daniel 9 intersects with the other verses of Scripture so that they all build together. But based on just the passage itself in its own context, there are some different ways to go with it. Now, my approach, as last week, this week also, is to take the same approach as this commentary series called the Exegetical Summaries Series. I'm going to ask questions of the text and give you the reasonable answers to the questions. And you may not agree with the answers. It's impossible to agree with all of them because some of them oppose one another. So it's just where do you think the emphasis lies? Now I'm going to summarize the four views of the first few verses. Basically, we're talking about, in this whole section, the 70 weeks of Daniel. I'm just going to refer you, if you weren't here last week, just watch the YouTube video online to get all of that background for the whole context of the 70 weeks. But what we talked about last week covered the first 69 of those 70 weeks. And then today we're going to wrap it up with the 70th week of Daniel. But what are the first 69 weeks? What do they mean? And I'm going to give you four different options for what those first 69 weeks could entail. The first one begins with the first week being timed with the Edict of Cyrus. And that's one of the key things. All four of these options pick a different starting date for when do the 70 weeks begin. And that's one of the key differences between them all, because we have just this reference in Daniel to the word goes out for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Well, the week begins in this theory with Cyrus, whose word was allowing the Jews to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That came out in 538 BC. It officially ended the exile in Babylon, the 70 years that Jeremiah had talked about, and which were the 70 years of exile. So Cyrus ended it by saying, okay, you Jews can go home and you can rebuild the temple. Then after a symbolic 7 weeks of years in this theory, the anointed one is Nehemiah, who comes back to actually rebuild the city. They were allowed to come back to the city by Cyrus's edict, but they rebuilt the temple and then they stopped doing anything. So it wasn't until Nehemiah returned that they actually rebuilt the city around the temple, because the city had been in rubble this whole time. And then the 62 weeks that come after the 7 weeks is just Jerusalem, rebuilt and functioning, but surrounded by hostile people. They didn't want them to rebuild the city in the first place. They'd even opposed the temple rebuilding. And so their relationship between Jerusalem and the surrounding nations was always uneasy from that point forward. And so that's what the 62 weeks entail. That's one option. Now, I think the strongest pro for this option is that it begins with the Edict of Cyrus. Cyrus's edict was indeed a major change in the situation for the Jews. So that edict makes sense as a starting point, and to say this is the beginning of a new thing going on with the Jews when they come back into the Promised Land after exile. The biggest con is that the rebuilding of Jerusalem by Nehemiah is way more than 49 years after the Edict of Cyrus. It may not seem like that when we're reading through Ezra and Nehemiah, that story arc, because we move from Zerubbabel, who was the first one to come back, to Ezra pretty quickly. And we don't get the sense in our modern ears of the time elapsed. There's this gap of time, about 100 years almost, which is way too much for 7 sets of 7 years. 7 sevens would just be 49 years. Not anything close to the near 100 years between Cyrus and Nehemiah. So if we take this tack, we have to basically say that the years are theologically symbolic and not chronologically accurate. The writer, Daniel, and the vision, or Gabriel, who's explaining it, is giving theologically relevant numbers, but not chronological numbers. I mean, that's where we have to land with this theory. That's one of the biggest cons to it. The numbers really don't matter except as theological messaging. That's all they are. By the way, most of the scholars who take this option would say that the 70th week happens during the time of Antiochus IV and point to his rule. And we'll look at some of that today because we're going to talk about that 70th week. But the scholars who take that rule, which means that the 7 weeks are too short to match Nehemiah's actual time, and the 62 weeks are way too long because it puts us way past the time of Antiochus if we just add up the numbers. So in other words, that's the biggest con to this whole theory, is that the numbers really don't correspond to actual years in any way. It's just symbolic messaging. Second option. This is before Cyrus. In fact, this is while the exile is still happening. Jeremiah writes his letter to the exiles and says it's going to be 70 years from the beginning to the end of the exile. The exile had already started when Jeremiah wrote his letter, but he wrote it and sent it to the exiles. If we start with that date and we look about 7 weeks of years down the road, we can actually see Cyrus making his edict in 538. And it's not exactly 49 years either, but it's a lot closer than the 100 years between Cyrus and Nehemiah. So it's just a little bit of a wiggle room on the 7 weeks of years adding up from Jeremiah to Cyrus. Now the biggest, and the 62 weeks also is Jerusalem surrounded by hostile people. You know, that's the one thing that they agree on. Actually, there are 2 things that all scholars will agree on. One is when Gabriel says 77s or 70 weeks, he's talking about years of time, not weeks of time. And the second thing they all agree on is that the 62 weeks is this period of Jerusalem being surrounded by hostile neighbors, but basically holding their own. That's the only thing they all agree on, but they do agree on that. Now, the strongest pro for this is that Jeremiah's letter is actually in the context of Daniel 9, because that's what Daniel is meditating on when he begins his prayer at the beginning of the chapter. So Jeremiah's letter is in view of Daniel, and he's meditating on it. So for Gabriel to refer to that document in his discussion would make sense because Daniel's been meditating on that word. But the strongest, and also it's also a strong point that the time between Jeremiah and Cyrus is close to 70, or close to 49 years. It's a little more than that, but you could rough it around to 7 times 7 years. Also, Cyrus is called an anointed one in the book of Isaiah, so talking about the coming of an anointed one does sort of dovetail with the mention of Cyrus, if that's who it is. So those are the pros. The con is that Jeremiah's letter doesn't seem like a strong option for the going out of the word to rebuild the city. The implication from the wording is that the command allows the rebuilding of the city. It doesn't anticipate the rebuilding of the city. It initiates the rebuilding of the city. So the wording doesn't quite match up with what Jeremiah is doing in his letter to the exiles when he says, there will come a time when you come back and reestablish Jerusalem. So that's option 2. Option 3, the first week begins with the decree of Artaxerxes in 458, allowing Ezra to lead more exiles back. Now, this one's tricky to begin with because, and this is one of the cons to this argument, because there is no command to rebuild anything with Ezra. The temple's already been rebuilt, and the city isn't in view with Ezra's return. He's just going back and taking a bunch of Levites with him and reestablishing more Torah law. So the Torah is the focus of this move for Ezra, not the building of the city. But if we take this, and if we ignore the 7 years as a separate time frame and just say the anointed one is coming back not at the end of the first 7 sets of 7, but at the end of those 69, then we can say the anointed one is Jesus, and this happens at his baptism in 26 AD, and the time frame works out almost exactly. You could actually see 69 weeks of years going from Ezra, the command to Ezra, to the baptism of Christ in 26 AD. That's when people think maybe he was baptized. It works out to that for him to have been crucified then 3-ish years later in 30 AD. So that's a literal thing, and then of course the 69 weeks is the same. Now the strongest pro to this argument is that it is mathematically sound. The years work out very closely to this concept. And Jesus getting baptized and receiving the Spirit at that is very resonant with anointing language. So it could work there. The biggest objection to this interpretation, I think, is that it ignores the 7 weeks as irrelevant. The breakdown of 7 plus 62 doesn't mean anything. Nothing particularly happens 49 years after Ezra leads the exiles back. So you have to just add the two together to come with 69 and ignore the break between them. Then option 4 is similar, but this one begins with the decree from Artaxerxes I to Nehemiah in 445 or 444 BC. So this also ignores the 7-week break to say it's 7 plus 62 and just goes with the whole 69. It says that the years are prophetic years consisting of only 360 days, or 360 days, not 365 or anything, 360 days. So if you take 360, multiply it by 69, and then by 7 and come up with the number of days, then you can reach from Artaxerxes' command in 444 BC to the triumphal entry in 33 AD. So if you mark it from triumphal entry, not baptism, then you can make the math work by doing all this. Now, the strongest pro in this opinion, in my opinion, for this interpretation is that the rebuilding of the city by Nehemiah makes sense as the starting decree, because it's the only decree that's explicitly about rebuilding the city. All the other decrees have been about rebuilding the temple or allowing the Jews just to go back, or like I said with Ezra, it's just about Torah. It's not really about
any rebuilding of a physical thing. So here is a command about rebuilding the city. Makes sense. And so that's a big, strong pro. But I can't get past ignoring the leap years, the ancient leap years that were added every 6 years. I learned this. I had to research it to figure this out, because you can't possibly have a calendar of 360 days consistently, especially in an agrarian economy, because that would put your seasons off in a matter of 5 or 6 years. You would be in a completely different season of the year during this. And all of their calendars were driven primarily off their agricultural cycles and then the cycles of the stars. And the Babylonians did love the number 6, and 360 is a multiple. But what they did to accommodate this 360 days issue was every 6 years, they added another month of 30 days. So every 6 years, there was a whole new month that wasn't in any other year, and they would have it as a festival month, of course, because it was so special, happening only once every 6 years. So they would do this to offset the fact that they were gradually getting away from the correct season of the year by month. This theory ignores that leap year of the ancient Babylonians, which they would not have ignored because they lived it. They knew that was there. So to me, that's the weak point in this interpretation, is ignoring it. So that brings us now to verse 26, though. Depending on which one of these first 4 views is kind of interpreting what you think about these last 2 verses in the 70th week. Verse 26 in Daniel 9 says, "After the 60 and 2 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and he shall have nothing. And the people of the coming leader will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will be with the flood, and on to the end there shall be war. These desolations are determined." All right, so let's break this down bit by bit like we did last week. First phrase here I want to look at, after the 60 and 2 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and he shall have nothing. And the question is, who is this anointed one? We looked at last week how the translation, if they capitalize anointed one, they are meaning to have you think about Jesus, because then they have interpreted it that way, and they're capitalizing it because it's proper to capitalize a reference to deity. So they would capitalize it, and they would write the anointed one rather than an anointed one. Right. And here, as in the context last week, in Hebrew, there is no the. It's an indefinite phrase, so it's an anointed one. But that interpretation is a common one. They would say it's Jesus Christ, and that's who the anointed one is. And it's the same anointed one from the previous verse. So if you interpret it this way, where it's just all 69 weeks together, and the anointed one who comes at the end of the 69 weeks, then it's a reference to Jesus, and that's who the anointed one is, who will be cut off. If you take this and interpret it as a reference to the time of Antiochus, then this anointed one who's cut off is Onias III, who was a high priest who was killed by Antiochus IV in 171 BC. So the Jews who saw Daniel's prophecy as applying to the time of Antiochus did see an anointed one cut off at the time, and they thought of him when they read Daniel. And his name was Onias III. Well, what about the next phrase in verse 26? The people of the coming leader will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will be with the flood. So who is the coming leader? That's another question. If it's Jesus who is the anointed one, who is this one coming? Well, it's often understood to be Titus, the Roman general, who destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So again, it's coming at the attack where it's Jesus who is cut off and has nothing. By the way, that has nothing thing talks about how when Jesus was crucified, all his disciples left. So he was completely abandoned. If you take it as the Antiochus days, cutting off and have nothing means how Antiochus was eradicating all of the Jewish worship at the time as well. But if the coming leader is Titus, he is the one who is going to come and bring destruction, and he is the one who destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. If you take it with the ancient context of Greece or the Seleucids, Antiochus was a Seleucid king, that Antiochus destroyed it. He is the coming leader who cut off the anointed one and is destroying the city. He pillaged Jerusalem in 169 and then plundered the temple in 167. And then on to the end there shall be war. These desolations are determined. What is this mention of war? What war are we talking about? Exactly what conflict? Well, if you take this as this Jesus and we're talking about the future, then we're talking about how Jews will suffer periodic times of pain and suffering until the second coming. From the destruction of Jerusalem on until Christ returns, the fate of the Jews will be to suffer this time of war. It won't be all-out war all the time, but it will just be antagonism all the time. And occasionally it will be genocide, as you know, we can roll World War II into this and the Holocaust. So this could mean that there's going to be times of conflict for the Jews up until the end. And when he says the end in this interpretation, it means the end of time, when Christ returns. The flood is something that is sudden and overwhelming. And so it is a metaphor for the suddenness of the destruction and the overwhelming nature of it, where it just destroys everything in its path. So how was it interpreted by the Jews and by those who see it as this time of Antiochus? Well, they would say that the end is probably with Antiochus' death, and that there's just going to be constant struggle between the Seleucid kings and the Jews, that this was a period of conflict. Just to argue this point, not saying that I'm saying it's absolutely right, but remember that when the Jews were under the Ptolemies, and under what would be called the king of the south, the Ptolemies, the Egyptian, they were pretty much peaceful, and they got along pretty great. And that was the period of time when they created the Septuagint, and all of the relationships were pretty fruitful. But when the Seleucids came in, it got a lot harsher, and there was a lot more conflict and difficulties leading up to Antiochus' persecution and trying to eradicate Judaism, basically, when he was the king, at least for a while. And so this was a very difficult time. So they read this phrase to say there's going to be war till the end as this struggle between the Jews and the Seleucid rulers until at least Antiochus' death. So that's how they would read it. Also, let me point out, we are not to the end of Daniel. And Daniel 11 is going to tell us a little more information for us to read back into Daniel 9 and perhaps even Daniel 7. Because all of these are pictures, I think, that work off of each other. Now let's go to the final verse of Daniel 9:27. And he will make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week. But in half of the week he will let cease sacrifice and offering, and in its place a desolating abomination comes, even until the determined complete destruction is poured out on the desolator. All right, so let's take this first phrase, and a lot hinges on this little pronoun he. He will make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week. And this is where, again, some of the interpretations diverge. Who is he? Well, one way to take it is that the he is Jesus. The anointed one is the he, as was referred to in the previous context. The one who was cut off is the he. He is the one we're talking about here. He is the one who makes the covenant. And in this understanding, he makes a covenant during his earthly ministry, and a covenant that was ultimately established in his crucifixion. So his covenant is part of his ministry. He's making this covenant. And then he dies in order to enact it. That's one way to read it, this. And those who say that this was fulfilled, all 70 weeks were fulfilled up through Jesus' earthly ministry, would say this is what it means. But, of course, there are some who say that he is the coming leader, not the anointed one. If the he is the coming leader of the previous verse, then he's an antagonist, not the protagonist, and that could be Antiochus. Like taking that ancient interpretation, he is the one who made a covenant, is Antiochus IV, who did make a pact with the Jews until he broke it and tried to eradicate the Jews. So Antiochus, who is known as a double dealer, had a reputation for always working the angles and using deceit to get his way. This is an angle for understanding it as Antiochus. He's the one who makes the covenant. But it's also understood to be the ultimate Antichrist, who will make a peaceful covenant with Israel before breaking that one himself. You may wonder, if you're not accustomed to this interpretation, how did we get all the way to the Antichrist in this situation? Because we've been talking about these weeks as historical, and even up to this point, about Jesus coming as part of this view. Well, in one popular interpretation of this, there is a break between the 69th week and the 70th. An indefinitely long break that has still not ended. We're still between these 2 weeks. The 69th week, by this view, ended with Jesus' earthly ministry. Maybe they might even point to saying that it ended at his crucifixion when the Christian era began. It's dispensational premillennialism, to give it a name. Dispensational premillennialism says that God was dealing with the Jews up until Jesus' crucifixion, at which point then he is dealing with the Gentiles. They make a strong divide between God's program up until Christ and his sacrifice and his program after that. And that the Jews aren't even really in view anymore after Jesus' death. And so there is, and the 70th week begins when God resumes his focus on the Jews. And that they time to a period after the rapture. In fact, the rapture would be the close of the time of the Gentiles. So the beginning of this time, Jesus' crucifixion, the end of the time is the rapture. And in between is this period between the 69th and the 70th week. That's their take on it. They justify it in this context by going back, let's skip back here, to verse 26. So you notice the opening of the verse says, after the 60 and 2 weeks. It does not say in the 70th week, but after the 60 and 2. And so this view says that's different. After the 60 and 2 is not the 70th week. And of course, I say 60 and 2, but it's the 7 weeks have already also been incorporated into this. So there's the 7 weeks, there's the 62 weeks, and then there's the 70th week. And everybody agrees that those are the 3 big sections. But this, the premillennial dispensational says there's this huge time differential between the end of the 69th week and the beginning of the 70th. To me, okay, I'm just going to be frank, I just don't see the text supporting this idea. And partly it's because I don't see a rapture, as we've already talked about from 2 Thessalonians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, where the rapture idea sort of gets its start. I don't read it that way. When I think about us coming to go with Christ when he returns, I think about us joining him to be with him, but then returning to the earth to establish his kingdom. So this is why I don't see Daniel 9 in these ways. But if it was completely invalid, I wouldn't be pointing it out as one possible interpretation. It is understood by some as that period. And that's then how they read it. What ends the sacrifice? Let's go into the last couple of things in this phrase. In half of the week, he will let cease sacrifice and offering. Well, for those that say that Jesus' earthly ministry is the establishing of this covenant, and that is what fills out the 70th week, they would say that his crucifixion, which was 3.5 years into his earthly ministry, is what lets cease the sacrifice. Now, it doesn't literally end them killing animals at the Temple Mount. But what those who take this tack would say is that his sacrifice eliminated the need for that killing, and that any killing of animals after Jesus' sacrifice was pointless, unnecessary, and not a genuine sacrifice at all, because that ended with Jesus. Of course, some would say that this is Antiochus, that he ended the sacrifices by intervening in the temple and stopping them. And this is probably the strongest point for arguing that this is Antiochus, and this is this description of ending the sacrifices, because that's what's been on the mind. It was in Daniel 7. This was on his mind, the ending of the sacrifices. And so this picture of the end of sacrifice, 3.5 years, or halfway into a period of 7, that's what it means for Antiochus. He ends the sacrifices for 3.5 years. Of course, those who say that the 70th year is all the way at the end, after the rapture, would say that this is the Antichrist who will terminate all religion but his own for 3.5 years. So they point forward in time to that as an echo of Antiochus, perhaps, but point out it's a different thing. So in its place is a desolating abomination. And this is one of these phrases we will see again in chapter 11 of Daniel, and get some more context on it. But what is that? Well, some people would say it was the introduction of Roman imperial symbols into the temple courts back in the time of Christ or after that, which triggered the Jewish revolt, which then triggered the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So this is pointing in that direction. Some say that, again, if it's Antiochus that we're talking about, it was when Antiochus built a little temple, his little altar on top of the altar that was dedicated to Zeus or the Lord of Heaven. That was the desolation that caused desecration. And some would say that in the future, this points to an image of that Antichrist being erected in the temple grounds. So it's, again, like what Antiochus did, but it's about somebody else. It isn't an either-or proposition necessarily, because the things that are going to happen in the future are similar to the things that happened in the past. And so what we have is maybe a double fulfillment. That this is talking, in one point, from a historical point of view, about something happening with the Jews in the temple in Jerusalem in the 170s. But something very much like that is going to happen again in the future when the Antichrist, the one with a capital A, comes to oppose Christ and is going to repeat the same kinds of behaviors as Antiochus. Matthew 24, that's right. When Jesus is talking about the end times, he alludes to these passages in Daniel. The question is he alluding them in Daniel because Daniel is talking directly about the Antichrist in the future, or is he alluding to Daniel because what the Antichrist do is similar to what Daniel was talking about? Is he saying that this applies again? It already applied once, but now it's going to apply again in the future. This is an unfolding thing with Daniel. Each chapter of prophecy, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and chapter 11, and Daniel 12, it finishes the thought, are all very relevant to each other in trying to put all the pieces together. So we will look at that. The very last phrase of the chapter is that this will continue until the determined complete destruction is poured out on the desolator. What is that? Well, some would say that is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's the complete destruction. I don't know about that. Because it's talking about the desolator, not the desolated. And so it's the temple that's desolated. So I don't know. But that's kind of where they say this whole destruction is going. It could be the death of Antiochus. I mean, he is the desolator in that paradigm, in that understanding, and he is killed. And that basically ends the problem. Antiochus actually ended the abomination. He took away the abomination before he died, because Antiochus was getting pressure and realized that this was not helping, to rile up the Jews like this was not helping. So he actually came off of that before he died, but then he died. And so the Jews would say that was the ultimate end to this desolator. And of course, it could be the Antichrist being thrown into the lake of fire in the book of Revelation. And that's going to be the end of all desolators at that point. And so I have no problem looking forward to that point. I think that in my mind, Daniel is primarily talking or historically talking about the situation with Antiochus, but I think the situation with Antiochus is going to find its way again into history with the Antichrist. And that's what I think Jesus was doing when he was referring to it in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and in John, and when he's talking about this Antichrist coming. Somebody is going to take a page out of Antiochus's book and do it all again. And so that's what I think is how we take it. But we're not finished with Daniel, so we'll see how this goes.
Thanks again for joining me in this study of Daniel as we unpack the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. If you have a comment or a question you'd like to ask about the lesson, please feel free to add it in the YouTube comments or hop over to Facebook and find the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group there. You can email me at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net as well. I hope you are enjoying our study of Daniel, and I hope to see you again soon as we continue to unpack the treasures in the biblical text.